Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the record of Lodos War of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka I know we didn't talk about it, but I figured you'd let me borrow your amp.
And I am the black metal guy, aka Hagfish Alfredo.
Ooh, a real delicacy of a dish there.
I enjoy, I enjoy a meal of Hagfish Alfredo followed by a viewing of Record of Lodos War.
Oh, yeah. Oh, man, my wife just started showing me that. You ever seen that, dude?
At a university anime screening when I was in, middle school many years ago.
Oh, man, you should watch it again now. It's like a Rosetta Stone to all of the, anime interpretations of Western fantasy stuff. It's, when I was watching, I was amazed. It's this very kind of primitive, very direct interpretation of, especially, early, Western computer role-playing games, wizardry and Ultima and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, this is basically Zelda.
Yeah. But you've got what's clearly a D&D adventuring party. It's just really cool. It's as soon as I started watching, I was like, oh, everything snaps into place. The whole lineage of all this stuff.
Yeah. I'd watch it. I remember liking it fine then, and probably the historical thing would be good.
It's got cute elf girls. I know that's important to both you and me.
Yeah, it's
essential.
It's objectively important. Definitely,
a crucial aspect of all anime viewing here on Terminus.
It's one of the 5 pillars of Terminus. Crushing posers. Seeing them driven before you, hearing the lamentations of their women. Listening to metal and cute elf girls.
That's. I think everybody listening can probably agree with that sequence there. but to we're on a very irregular sort of recording schedule lately because both you and I were taking trips out of town. But we're back, so as not to delay things any further. Speaking of crushing posers and seeing them driven before us, what do we have for our little mini review starting the night?
We have an EP that instantly endeared itself to me because it has something like the Loch Ness Monster on its cover. This is Serpentine Descension by Galicia. It's an independent release. So this was submitted as Galicia, by the way, an interesting place, Asia Minor. It was in Asia Minor, and I believe. Oh wait, sorry, no. I'm confusing that with Galicia. Galicia is in Spain, I think, or something like that.
That's Galicia, anyway. I believe. So I don't know. Maybe this isn't even a real place. Let me see.
It's no. It's the C is lisped. It's Galicia. Yeah.
Yeah. No. It's I just looked up Galicia or Halachina is a historic region from southeastern Poland and western Ukraine.
But also northwest Iberian Peninsula, which might be Basque or Portuguese. No, autonomous community of Spain.
It's both and neither at once, I suppose.
All right, so the answer is we don't know what the fuck this band is named after, and we'd be interested to hear. And we will eventually find out, because, disclaimer, Guy is a patron of the show. But yeah, he submitted this to us for review, and it seemed like it is indeed the kind of thing we would review. Yeah. So, you could compare this to a lot of things, but I think something we both landed on is this sounds a lot like Axis of Advance and Sacramentary Abolishment.
Yeah.
Which definitely are two configurations of the same band, and is one of our favorite bands. Mm-hmm. And something we did a bonus episode on. I was tipped off to that maybe in part because this guy on our Discord has mentioned he likes those, but it's pretty apparent, right?
Oh yeah, it's readily apparent. I mean, it seems like one of the central objectives of this band is to resurrect that sound. And not to put too fine a point on it, but who else is trying to resurrect that sound, intentionally or unintentionally? That would be Into Oblivion, who did Winds of Serpentine Ascension back in 2020.
Ooh,
yeah.
Ooh,
doing the multi-layered references to that whole scene.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, even without being tipped off, because I think you had mentioned we had a patron who talked to us about really liking the episode about Sacramentary and AOA, and
yeah, that was another guy, but this guy liked it too. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's so I didn't necessarily put two and two together that this was the same patron or was related or in some way, but the Sacramentary abolishment and the Axis of Advance are immediately apparent. And that seems to be one of the central objectives of this band, like I said, is to revive that sound or do a new spin on it.
Yeah, which is cool because it is a I think those are deeply cult bands, and you don't hear much stuff that sounds like it. They are in some sense war metal, but most modern or almost virtually all modern war metal sounds nothing like that, and has not learned lessons from it. So we basically agree from the start. Good idea. Axis of Advance has, which is the sort of, I guess, I really like Sacramentary too, but an Axis of Advance is sort of the final form of the idea, right?
Yeah.
And that has three things, right? Convulsive blasting death metal, noble melodic black death, kind of Swedish influenced, and a persistent undertone of thrash, right? And this band does all three of those things, but is good at two of them.
Yeah, and we basically agree on the spread there. I would say I think that what this, it's kind of a surprise. I think this is actually more like Sacramentary than it is like Axis. There's certain aspects of Axis that really shine through, especially some of their later work, which we don't talk about a whole lot on the show. And I'll get to that, but Sacramentary and the Distracting Stone in particular seem to be it seems to be the prevailing influence here. But yeah, so all the constituent elements from that band, all of those are present, but it seems very clear where the strongest points are for these guys.
Yeah, as far as sounding more like Sacramentary, you could speak to the idea that it sounds more, that speaks to the idea that, like, the production is rawer on this, and it also emphasizes, you could say, sort of, the parts are less. Axis of Advance has pretty successfully blended all of the parts. Here you will get independent sort of thrash sections, or independent parts that sound like the better Swedish melodic death metal, or independent parts that sound more like the sort of, abrasive blasting. We both, so to give it away, we both pretty much, well, actually, let's just listen to a sample and we'll see if the listeners can guess it. So here's a sample that has all three of those parts delivered kind of in pretty distinct places. See if you can spot them, and which do you think is the weak link here. Let's go to Gurgling Void of Cataclysmic Revulsion, about 1 minute and 45 in.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we both agree that, right, what we hear in that sequence is you got the abrasive blasting stuff first. That's a big first section, and it has several sub-riffs within it, which I think we can get into. I just sort of mapped it out as we listened. Then we have a second section, which is this a good example of the kind of thrashy stuff here, which has some melodic contour to it and some atmosphere, but is sort of very, very aggressively played, and my favorite part. And we get the sick sort of good melodeath riff, and then we're back to the thrash, and then, in an example of subtle and cool songwriting, we are at another melodeath part, but a very different one at the end, and that's where we fade out.
Yeah. Yeah, I really, that is something I'll get to also when I talk a little bit more. These slowed down melodeath sections, the kind of doomy ones, are really standout parts on this record. But we got to talk about the elephant in the room. What's the weak link?
Well, it's we have to amputate. It's the it's the abrasive blasting stuff.
Yeah.
But we don't have to take the whole limb. Death metal guy, what do you think?
So we both agreed that, this is how it always goes whenever like a patron or somebody submits a song. We're always like way more nitpicky and aggressive about our critiques. So
which is the goal, right? It's like a workshop.
If anyone's going to appreciate it, it's the people who are that dedicated to this show. So it's very clear that the weakest parts of this record are the super chaotic, aggressive blasting parts, the ones that are the most like war metal, in a sense. It's not that they're terrible, it's that, well, it's a couple things. One, it's a matter of proximity to parts that are simply a lot better and a lot more memorable. And it's also the fact that, I was talking to you about this last night, I got the sense that some of these riffs, particularly these really chaotic kind of war metal riffs, were placed into the songs and were kind of placeholders. It was like, we want to do something like this, but for the sake of getting the song together and structuring out these kind of intricate, winding things, we'll do that for now and we'll come back to it. But it seems like a lot of them they didn't come back to. Not all of them are misses, but they tend to feel kind of perfunctory. You know, they're very clearly there to fill a role. None of them strike me as the centerpiece of any of these three songs. You know, they feel like they're functional riffs to build tension and aggression that gets released in these big kind of glorious melodic moments. So the question is, how do you refine those parts so they're as exciting as the rest of the songs? And there's a few possibilities there, but I've been talking for a while, so you go ahead.
Yeah, well, here, I've got a very definite idea of that. You said in the notes that, you know, we were sort of, or rather, we were talking on Discord about this, and you sort of pointed out, like, yeah, you know, they could keep some of that blasty. I said maybe they should just scrap the blasty stuff, or just, I mean, my initial idea was cut those sorts of abrasive blasting stuff and just put really retarded blast beats under some of the more thrashy or melodic stuff.
Yeah.
But, like, which is definitely something that they can do. That's one thing, one possibility. But, like, you made a good case for keeping some of the more dissonant stuff, which I think is fair. It's certainly important to the Axis of Advance formula, and you're right that when it does have a good role as a tension builder. I think what we agreed is that specifically the weak link are the seesawing dissonant leads.
Yeah, that's the one part. So obviously this is, I mean, to me...
Here, let me actually map it out.
Go ahead, yeah.
So for these guys, in that first riff sequence of... If for listeners at home, right, you probably just heard like a sequence of blasty stuff happening for a minute, right? You probably like half heard that while you sort of pivoted the forklift. But like, that actually has three riffs in it. The A riff is a pretty sick Axis style or even Diocletian style war metal slide riff, that's like much crisper than just sort of bludgeoning, blasphemy light kind of stuff. It's got this, got a cool, I like a cool pick slide, but it's got sort of tight, crisp, disciplined kind of thing, like, which is very Axis of Advance. The next two are these seesawing sort of queasy skronk riffs based on leads. So it goes A, B, C, B, C, and then we repeat that whole section again, and then it goes into the other stuff. The B and C, I think we agree, are the weak links. Mm-hmm. You just don't need to write riffs like that. Like, they're... and the thing is, like, it's only there to maybe be, like... As you said, it's sort of like... There's a placeholder thing to them. And at this point, those kinds of riffs, they don't make things seem more chaotic, or they don't make things actually more difficult. They're just a trope of their own kind, right? And it's almost like a disso-black trope. And it's not really where the heart of the music is. Whereas when you hear them go out of that into the fucking thrash riff, that part lands as more aggressive than the skronk leads because it has this clear direction, clear shape and direction, and because you can tell they enjoy playing it more.
Yeah, no, I think so actually I would disagree slightly, because I do like the C part of that riff, or at least kind of the conceit of it. It's like, basically holding this dissonant chord and then just kind of bending it really a little bit slowly and dramatically at the end. I mean, that's a kind of Diocletian thing, as you said, or almost like almost antediluvian in a way. I just think that the question is, how do you weave it into stuff that's that fast-paced? And I understand the attempt to recreate some of the sort of happy accidents of sacramentary abolishment. There's a lot of stuff that ended up so sick on SA that was almost certainly completely unintentional. I think there's a core of good ideas. I think the individual riffs just need refinement. I don't think there's any parts of this music that need to be removed. I think that, they already had the thrash stuff, and the melodic stuff is already in place. They just need to work on that. Just shore up the weakness there. You've already got it set with the rest of the material. Yeah, so I want to go to your sample? Yeah, sure. So here's something that I want to really point to that I find kind of unique about this band. Now, I mean, obviously we've been talking about sacramentary and Axis, and those are great things to sound like. But in the interest of what makes Galicia, well, there's one thing that I want to point to. And you got a little bit of it at the end of your sample, which is this prevailing subtle kind of funeral doom quality. They, these kind of almost funeral doom passages will pop up on, I think, just about every song on this EP. And they tend to hit. Also, just about every record we review today. Yeah, that's true. How's that? Anyway, continue. Yeah, but they land like a fucking sledgehammer. And this is something you heard Axis of Advance do a little bit on some of their stuff, especially on Obey, which is their final album before they broke up. I always had this theory that there is this little thread of funeral doom, in the midst of everything they did, like they were listening to Skepticism and Thergothon. And I think these guys almost certainly do. So we're going to listen to this huge doom section off the final track, Apocalyptic Iron Fist Death Fuck. Okay. So let's listen to this, and I'll point out some things that I think this connects to and how I think this can be really accentuated to make this band all its own.
Eternal fire, the next
So in that section, obviously the centerpiece, you've got the big flowing melodic part that opens it, but then they incorporate it into that awful kind of dissonant trudge that happens in the middle of that section, which I'm gonna go to bat and say is probably a direct reference to Wormphlegm. Yeah, I mean, if I was ever going to say someone on this show was directly listening to Wormphlegm, it's probably a guy who listens to the show, the same...
No, that's true. And there may actually be an Into Oblivion reference in the title. So, we've talked to this guy. He's a huge nerd. So, he's probably,
just the same set of, like, 2000s early internet weirdo metal influences might be at play. But that trudge section is so fucking cool. And it's so evocative, and I really love the vocalist, like, low, kind of burpy demi-lich vocals that you hear periodically throughout this record. It's awesome. And the vocal performance is worthy of mentioning, because some of the banshee shrieks on this thing are so fucking high and crazy. They're kind of remarkable. As guys that don't talk about vocal performances a lot, these are actually pretty exceptional.
Our guy is the vocalist, actually, I think. Pretty
yeah?
sure.
Okay, cool. But I really like the way, so you do this kind of nice, elegiac, slowed down melodeath lead intro, and then you fold that into the really ugly, trudging, dissonant passage, and then you come out the other side into something that's kind of motivically related, but way faster and more aggressive. It's really smart songwriting. I like how long they sit on it, which is very Axis of Advance, really giving these individual sections time to breathe, giving them the weight they deserve. And yeah, this one, I think this song, more than any other, points the way forward. It's a 9-minute track. It does everything extremely well. And I think it's excellent.
That's a fair... Thanks for calling my attention to that Doom stuff. I think in the overall flow of it, I lost that part in my ear, but, like, that's really good. And whereas the sequencing and the earlier stuff, in the earlier sample I played, could be altered, I think, and I'll try to suggest in a sec, the sequencing there is great.
Yeah. And... wrapping back around real quick, just to what I said right before we played it, I think that these moments, all of these very slow, almost funeral doom moments, should be a bigger feature of the music, because they happen on every song, they land really hard on every song, and I think just devoting even more time to those things would really set this apart from, Sacramentary and Axis, to make that a defining part of the music. It already is, but let's just take it further. Yeah, and the last thing I would suggest is just, I really like the blasty part at the end. I thought, like, really methodical, and sort of epic without hitting you over the head with it. There was like an A-B variation on... There were, like, nested turnaround variants that happened over a very long time frame. It was really cool. But, like, in terms of structuring and sequencing, so, okay, more prominent doomy stuff. And when you're doing these abrasive blasting parts, like, think maybe more... Like, this is the thing we agreed on last night. It's like, the doomy stuff and the more sort of noble sounding stuff is and the thrashing stuff is the core of the music. But keep those abrasive parts, but see how you can, like, consciously use them at the service of those other parts, rather than sort of, like, piling all the blasty dissonant stuff together, right? See how you can, like, intersperse it more. Think about I was actually just listening to Axis of Advance today, in part because of this. I was going to say, think about the sort of call and response riffs, the call and response sequences that, like, Axis of Advance does even on the second track of Strike, whose name I forget, but I'm sure they'll remember. Evanescent Judgment of the Last Era.
Yeah.
Years of mass decay, the dark people will not feel a power of play. Evil souls to play, the swords pulled down, fast for a minute, steel, so fucking rough. Laughing at the torso, ripped by the black, returned by the ends, hard in the car. Die! You'll fucking die! Let's go!
Back with Véhémence.
Ordalies.
Yes. You just dropped the C.
Yeah.
So this is on Antiq Records, a label that you've heard a bunch from on this show, and a label that at this point is kind of a friend of the show, I'd say. We first started covering their stuff with the Interlude record that came out at pretty much this exact time of year last year. And Anternose was a two-man project featuring the label's head, Evermore. And he was doing the sort of the guitars and main riff writing stuff in that band, I believe. And I want to start off just by clearing up a lineup confusion that I had and may have perpetuated on the show. He's a core member of Véhémence, but in Véhémence, his main thing is vocals, as well as auxiliary stuff like flute and psaltery, which honestly, I have to look up. Like a dulcimer kind of thing. Or a zither. So he's mostly vocalist and lyricist and concept guy in this project, and the guitarist is a guy who's just credited as Toolstra, and doesn't have much else to his. There's a project called Winter Nest to his name on Metal Archives, but not much else, and that's pretty old. So a mysterious figure on guitar. And on this record, they're joined by the drummer T. Leitner, or Thomas Leitner from Austria. And, the drumming is pretty phenomenal here. So that's the basic lineup rundown. Véhémence, we've talked about a lot on the show, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, they're they're the probably primary reference point for this whole style of black metal.
Yeah, we talk about them as one of the cornerstones of French chivalric black metal, and I often mention them in the same breath as Aurlac, who sort of originated this style. However, with Aurlac kind of boofing it on last year's record, this is a chance for Véhémence to sort of step into the lead and sort of claim the crown. So we'll see how they do. Speaking of which, it's been 3 years since the last one, which, given how prolific this scene around this label is, seems kind of like a long time. And I've kind of got a conceit for what's happened in the intervening years and what's sort of distinctive about this record. What's happened since then is kind of the construction of a kingdom around this label. So, there's a lot about this album that reminds me of something Satanic Warmaster says on his website, which is, we deal with material that inspires us on our journey towards our own kingdom. A kingdom that is not yours, but bears a resemblance to the one there could be for you. Right? It's kind of funny, but it also sticks with you.
Yeah.
And with this... With this label Antiq and the scene around it, these guys have really built their own kingdom. This entire sort of cast of sort of musicians and people doing supporting stuff and whatever. Just this record has a bunch of guest and session stuff. We've got someone on bass, someone on cello. We've got the guy from Pedret's, Geoffroy Delaria, on flute. He also guested on Anternose. We've got a guy playing Nyckelharpa, and we've got a guy doing some hurdy-gurdy and extra vocals. So this is kind of this is a big undertaking, and it reflects, I think, the distance that this scene has come since Véhémence fired that kind of defining album off a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I don't think it's even a matter of debate or perspective. I mean, even with just the stuff that Antiq has released since we've started the show, even if Antiq was just that, this would still be known and talked about 30 years from now. 30 years from now, there would be a band. It's like, we're doing kind of the old school Antiq thing, from right around 2020. It's going to be a topic of conversation. This is a style of music in and of itself. And, I mean, I don't think it's even a question of, like, the kingdom being built. It's there. It's part of history already.
Yeah. Well, that's a very nice way of putting it. So the realm has been established. I think you'll hear that playing out on the record in various ways. So first, let's start with, I've got my own, I listen to Par la Sang Versailles a lot. I've got my line on this record, but what did you make of it as a whole?
It's really fucking good. You know, I did not expect anything less. It's a really fun album. I mean, I knew it was going to be fun, but it's like, boy, this is kind of musical candy in a lot of places, but it's also got a tremendous amount of depth and texture to it, and it does reward repeated listens. You know, it's the best of both worlds. It has immediate impact, huge hooks, but also a ton to discover on following listens. I am very interested, you know, if we see Véhémence as like a flagship band for Antiq, you know, being sort of the paradigm from which all the other artists descend, I think there are moves being made on this record that it suggests really interesting things about the perspective that these guys have of this music and where it may go in the future. I get one of my, I guess, the hottest take that I would have, and I think that you'll probably agree to a certain degree on this, is that I don't think that this style is particularly concerned with being black metal anymore.
Yeah, we've talked about that. Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, I think we've talked before about how the Antiq stuff sort of, the lineup sort of includes things that could be called black metal, but it's all grouped in a different way. It's all grouped with stuff that you could also call folk metal, but that has black metal-y things about it. And it's often quite different from older kinds of folk metal. Sometimes less different from it, right? Or you've got stuff like Asset, which is sort of rooted in, you know, black metal in spirit, kind of, but rooted in hardcore, right? There's this. It's what we talked about with Serpent Dweller last week. It's like, sure, black metal will always persist as an important aesthetic category and as the root of this whole tradition, and most crucially of a spirit, right? But like, you know, it's not the dominant way. It's ceasing to be the main way to parse these things, right?
Yeah. Well, I think more specifically in relation to Antiq, I was talking with the Terminus intern, Hyper Shaman, about this a little bit earlier today, because he was talking about the record, and he said something that I was turning over in my head and I think is very correct, which is that the Pedrettes record from last year signaled a big shift. You know, that was a record that we had, you know, there were things we liked about it and things that we didn't, but it was clearly centering on a certain idea of what this style of music is generally supposed to be. And I think you hear that bearing out here, albeit in a different and probably better way, but I think we can see the Pedrettes record, in hindsight, as what may be a turning point for this whole style. And I'll get into that in specific musical terms a little bit later, but I think we're going to look back on that record as a hinge point for where things really started to change.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. And with the, you know, you could say one thing that separates this from the last Véhémence is that this sort of range of non-black metal range of styles is they're all gathered on this record. And it's yeah, well, here we'll get into it now, right? So Par la Sang Versailles was it would be, you could also argue that that's not really black metal, that it's, you know, the French version of solar metal, right? You know, it's not like something like Spite Extreme Wing, or I don't know, what's another good example? You know, Maquahital from the US or something. You could argue that its orientation is, you know, that it has black metal intensity and aggression, but that it's expressing a meaningfully different kind of different kind of different kind of atmosphere and spirit. But, like, you can also say structurally in many ways it is down the line just a very melodic, flowery, and noble black metal record. And it's one of the best things a black metal or any extreme metal record can be, which is just every song is the same, not the same song, but the same kind of song. And each one is meaningfully different in cool and surprising ways, and they're all insanely good.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, and on that record, they develop this, who knows, I actually haven't heard the first record. Maybe it's already on the first record. But the melodic work on this is just outstanding, really authentic. It develops like this sort of melodic language that sure has a lot to do with black metal, with melodic death metal from the good stuff from Sweden. But you can hear also just the actual medieval and folk music in it. And a creative interpretation on, like, you know, how Gothic cathedral stained glass music might sound. Mm-hmm. And so they're just develop this fully realized language of riff, melody, and harmony. And so the question is, where do you go after that? Right? And this record is a pretty... Ordalies is, I think, a very convincing and interesting answer to that question. So to start, let's remind people of what was really cool about Par la Sang Versé and just the core of this band's riffing style as it sort of just burst onto the scene on that record. And then we'll get directly into our samples. So this is from... probably one of the single most noble moments in black metal ever. This is towards the end of the record. This is La Dernière Chevauchée, the last cavalry charge.
Sous la dernière chevauchée.
Very expensive horse go. Burr.
No cheap horses here.
None. No, I mortgaged an entire fief for this horse. And anyway, so after that magnificent, glorious cavalry charge of a riff, keep that phrase in your head, that descending scale run. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. See, I've listened to this song a lot, but and I missed some of those notes. But one thing that's cool about this, we talked about this with Anternos too, is that the riffs relate to singable melody. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so keep that theme in mind, and then listen to this riff from the second track of the new one, which is Ordalies. So the second track here is La Divine Sorcellerie. So I think that's just sort of like the divine sorcery.
the same picture.
Yeah, right. That is the same downward scale run sort of basic melodic stem that's at the heart of La Dernière Chevauchée. Mm-hmm. And you get things that are a little like that throughout Par la Sang Versée, and elsewhere on this record. But here it's really recognizable. And so in some sense, that is, I mean, the melodic heart of the riff is the same. But it's not merely recycled. It's not exactly the same riff, and not only that, it's not merely recycled. How would you describe what he's done to the to that older riff?
I'm gonna take a shot in the dark. I bet there's one of these on the first album also. So I think, so you've got the same general idea, the same motif of that downward scale run, but then what you've also got is him doing what was naturally already suggested by it, which is singing over it, adding harmonic vocal accompaniment, playing with the riff just enough so that it's refreshed for the new record, but there's a thread of continuity to previous stuff, and it would not surprise me if future stuff as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a major theme, and honestly, like, it's one of those things, it's like, a really cool character coming back in another, in a novel or something, right, from a previous part of the series, right? It's just like, yes, it's that riff, our friend.
It's like, right? The Cenotaph riff, or the World Eater riff.
Exactly. But he's done cool things to it, which is like, you can hear the different mood here. The entire mood of the last Par la Sang Versée has some questing and whatnot, but it's a very sort of straightforward, martial, aggressive mood, sort of in a kind of like light and joyous aggression, but like it's sort of very sort of knightly combat through and through. The emotion and atmosphere here is a bit more complex. And a bit more, that record was not in any sense dark. There's a bit more darkness here, right? There's that moment where he goes through a couple runs and then it sort of, you get that sort of, it rests on that dissonant interval and then just sort of like restarts. It sort of like descends to the bottom of the sequence, sort of deliberately hits a bum note and then restarts. And the feeling here is a lot more, at the end in La Dernière Chevauchée, it's like a sort of a severely descending riff, right? It's sort of decisive, the final charge, right? Mm-hmm. Sword swinging down, lances forward. Here it becomes this it sort of descends and then it spirals upward again. And you can hear that second guitar racing upward under it, which was an idea that was sort of on the previous one, but it's more here. And so the entire mood is one now that's a lot more of sort of like, there's more storm and stress here and sort of like striving and ambivalence.
Yeah, well, on the previous record, that's used with a note of finality. Here, it was interesting. We were having discussions about what we were sampling, and we had talked about, both of us wanted to sample stuff off this song. And it turned out we were in very similar places. And you were like, oh, you want the big riff? And I was like, I think so. And you were like, well, it doesn't start where you think it does. And I'm like, oh, so we're scanning this completely differently. So when I read I read that riff, especially with the context it has now it's preparatory for something else.
No, I think you're right about that, and really just in some sense they're just all the big riff.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily mean that's the core. I think what I really meant is like, oh, haha, it's another version of my favorite riff from the last album. Like, and I think I default to big riff when it's a really long melody with a lot of blasting under it. Mm-hmm. So. But I think you're right. Like, in some sense, that presents itself. It's, okay, the really long, gradually unfurling heroic melody, right? it presents itself as the big riff, but whereas on the last album it was a big riff, here it is I think I see what you mean. It's at a more transitional and sort of developmental part of the song. So you've got the answer to that.
Yeah, so exactly where we left off. And so here we get into it, especially after hearing that. So lately I've been talking to talking a lot to the drummer in my black metal band, and a lot of the stuff that I've been showing him is like stuff that we really like on the show, or just older stuff that he hasn't necessarily been exposed to, just like Satanic Warmaster, Goat Moon, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And what he always says is, So what happened? Like, when did black metal turn into power metal? And nobody told us anything. Or in the case of Goat Moon, when did black metal turn to like traditional heavy metal? And nobody told me. And I think stuff like this kind of confirms this idea of, this goes all the way back to the first season of the show when we were talking about that Paniquita record. Mm-hmm. The strange convergence of like black metal and power metal that's happened, and yet it contained entirely within the black metal scene itself, And I think that really comes out here in the same way that it came out really dramatically on that Pedret's record from last year. These melodic motifs you can absolutely tie to stuff like Lost Horizon, kind of obscure classics of European power metal. And I think that it's great. I like the fact that it's combining, black metal chording and textures with these, dramatic, bombastic flares of excitement, like you can hear right there. That's a long instrumental passage in black metal tradition. But if you break it down melodically, it doesn't really resemble black metal riffs of the past. It's something new.
Oh. Well, so first, of course, there's the big folk metal riff. Mm-hmm. Right? That could be on the Patriots record, or before that on the Anternos, which had a lot of just aggressive folk metal stuff on it. And then, the blasting part sort of fulfills maybe some of the tension that's built up on the earlier blasting part, right? But a good way of pointing out the way that it's kind of power metal-y is the way it resolves. Do-do-do, do-do-do, or sorry, do-do-do, 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 do-do-do. It resolves on like do-do-do, 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 do-do-do. That's like the end, that's like a pop resolution.
Yeah.
Right? That's like a big, epic pop or pop resolution. It's like any, even really poppy folk metal sounds like that. right? I'm not going to taint them by association by naming names, but I think one understands. And it's the weird thing is that they pull it off in part because it's earned by the intense movement of the melody that launches it, and by all the sort of tension and development that's come before.
Yeah. Yeah, it's using these kinds of melodies contextually, surrounded by higher tension and more aggression, which sort of naturally diffuses them of their softer qualities.
Yeah, more sophistication, and also more. Or it doesn't have, but in the case of this band, more sophistication in terms of like density of density of riffery and harmony, and also just more authenticity, right? You're going to hear much more authentic folk-sounding parts, right? They're not all like do-do-do, do-do-do, right?
Yeah.
So that all sort of earns those sort of big Wacken-oriented flourishes. And yeah, so I definitely hear what you mean about this sort of just defining its own territory that's not really black metal. Definitely got a bone to pick with your drummer about saying Satanic Warmaster is power metal, but
well, that was just among other things I've showed him,
But I think that was certainly the death metal underground take on Satanic Warmaster back in the day, something like that. And I think that's kind of the opinion I had back in the day in like 2010, because it sounded like a cool opinion to have.
Yeah.
It's like, that sounds like the sort of thing I think.
My drummer connects everything to, he's thinking of a lot of like old USPM stuff, and I can definitely within that context hear a lot of those ideas coming out. I think they're coming out from a different place, but I definitely see the similarity.
I hear the convergence. Yeah. All right. So have we said what we need to say about that part?
Yeah, let's move.
All right, so we are going to just the next track after. These are long songs also, but like meaningfully long songs. That last one was 11 minutes.
Yep, 11 minutes.
We get a brief we get a brief interlude, and then we're on track 4, Notre Royaume en Cendres. So, our kingdom in cinders. And this builds well off your sample, I think, because, your sample showed the kind of musical breadth on this record, and I think the dual samples on Divine Sorcellery sort of showed the long-form composition that's happening, right? Where, that turnaround at the end fulfills an idea that starts with those downward scalar runs at the beginning of my sample, right? So composing on a very long time frame and with a lot of voices and a lot of ideas that tend to get pigeonholed in different genres but are connected. So, and I think this is a place where this album gets some of its own really distinctive melodic and harmonic arsenal that sets it apart from the previous record. So let's check it out. I'm going to do a quick dual sample because there are from parts closer to the beginning and then later in the song because stuff happens. But first off, we're going, let's just do the first one. quick, death metal guy. I've got to look up what counterpoint is.
Well, when a mommy guitar and a daddy guitar love each other very much, they want to make something that's a little bit of both of them.
Oh, I see. So the stork drops a dual-necked guitar. Okay, never mind. That's too many levels of retardation. All right. So basically, I was just making sure I was using the word right. But that is some of the most sophisticated that big melodic riff is some of the most sophisticated counterpoint I've heard from this band. It is the relationship between two or more musical lines or voices, which are harmonically independent, yet interdependent, depend on each other, yet independent in rhythm and melodic contour. There you go. So they're not exactly, it's not like an Iron Maiden tandem guitar line where they're exactly following each other rhythmically. There are places where they come together rhythmically and places where they sort of split apart. And harmonically, also, you get really cool disharmonies that are thrown into that phrase, into that melody at certain times and at other points resolve. It's complex and beautiful, and it's at that point it almost sounds like less like medieval and more like Baroque music.
Yeah.
That's just like a fugue or something. That's fucking sick, right? And that's the kind of sort of aggressively melodic riffing, aggressively florid riffing that you got on Par la Sang Versé, but the mood is very different, right? A lot more tension, and a lot more sort of, dissonance and push and pull in the harmony. And the way he gets there is also kind of like a classical mode of composition, and maybe Baroque, I don't know. But like the beginning of a romantic symphony, you might get like A and B themes trading and then launching a third theme.
Yeah.
Right? So you get those, yeah.
Well, no, that's one of the most essential parts of this record. You would be missing a lot, but perhaps not as much as you think if you boiled this record down to the perpetual dueling lead lines of the guitars. I mean, that is the centerpiece from which the rest of this record flows. And the fact that they're constantly, really constantly in interaction with each other like that is one of the most remarkable qualities of it. You've basically written two albums and you've layered them on top of each other. And they have to work in perfect sequence with one another. These are not simple variations of riffs, simple harmonic, interpolations. These are really elaborate, textured constructs. And it's, attention needs to be drawn to just how difficult it is to write that stuff, especially for an hour like they did on this record.
Yeah, for sure. The kind of complexity you get on here is not sort of like it's not the kind of technical masturbatory complexity you get on like Disso Black Death records, or it is it's the sort of complexity of abundance that you get in a cathedral, right? Just these lines shooting upward and spinning around each other and sort of turning, and these kinds of vaults and tracery and stuff like that, and it's a medieval sense of complexity. So that's really cool. And you could also hear in the trading themes before that gets launched, right? Again, there's a kind of noble, almost folk metal-y, chivalric melody, and then that trades with a much darker and more dissonant kind of trem thing. Anyway, it does that, and then there's a big transition, and it takes that noble chivalric theme, the A theme there, and turns it into Funeral Doom. don't do that on Funeral Doom albums.
Some of them, I just gotta show you the right ones. Quick, well, before you get into what you wanted to talk about, side note, but one, the drumming performance on this record is uniformly excellent. It's phenomenal, and there's a ton of musicality and dynamics and feeling to it. And I mentioned that specifically so that I can also say this has one of the best drum productions I've heard on a record in several years. Especially when things open up, slow down, get a little bit more space to breathe, you can really hear, the really delicate dynamic touches, the space that each individual drum voice is given to reverberate. It's really, really pretty sounding.
Yeah, I hear that. Also, note of clarification. Thomas Leitner also played on Par la Sang Versé. He was just listed as a session member, whereas now he's a full member of the band. Which is always nice, But yeah, so for sure the drums sound great. But yeah, so I don't really need to explain to anyone why that was fucking cool, right? We've done enough detailed talk about the riffing and stuff. The tandem, the sort of the counterpoint, again, as you were saying, that kind of like two albums at the same time in that Funeral Doom riffing is just phenomenal. And then, launches into this big stirring chorus that is like a summoning album, but like a summoning if burly.
Yeah.
Right? And I think a way I could, a way I have of distinguishing this from Par la Sang Versé is like in terms of, Arthurian myth, which, the French kind of, a lot of the main versions of it are French, and just, heroic myth in general, is that Par la Sang Versé is champions music, right? It's music for, like, the king's champion, or, for people in the role of the knight who is the fighter, or whatever, right? Like, Lancelot music. It's sort of, it's got quests, it's got battles, and it has this sort of, youthful energy. This record feels kingly. Mm-hmm. In terms of, whereas Par la Sang Versé has this sort of bright, radiant aggression and just intense focus throughout, right? The songs basically just work like colossal riff, slow part thrown in the middle because we can't have that the whole time, colossal riff. This record has way more range, and in the way of like fleshing out an entire world, right? Way more range of instrumentation, of riffing, and of emotion. And in this track, you can hear a solemnity that is not on Par la Sang Versé.
Yes. I mean, the whole presentation is matured.
Yes, and you can hear here. There's in the way that massive riff lands, and then the chorus, there's authority. And you can hear there's authority and the crown weighing heavily, right? Concern for the health of the realm, prior to the quest for the Holy Grail. Responsibility being born. And, it goes together with what I've seen of these dudes, with what I said about the label, even more with Antiq building his kingdom. The dude literally lives in a castle, or like a medieval fortress. And he's sort of built his world. And if you look back at the old Metal Archives picture, it's this sort of like deliberately goofy teenage shot of him like in basically doing the Men in Tights thing, right? He's got his Prince Valiant haircut and his sort of like very tight pants, and he looks like a medieval dude in casual wear. And if you look at him now, he's just like he's bulked out. He's got a beard. He's just like a solid, burly French ruralist BM guy. And you can hear that change which is, I'm sure, one way or another, a change they've all gone through in the music, for sure. This is like... Par la Sang Versé was boyish, like in a good way, like in the way that an adult that an adult man can have boyish energy, that kind of vigor and enthusiasm. This is man's music.
right, we are back with our final record of the night. It's kind of cool. Both of the main reviews today are, related to people that are kind of close to the show at this point. You had Evermore with Véhémence, and now we get to talk about Floris with the new Meslamtaea record, Weemoedsklanken, released, as always, on Babylon Doom Cult Records. For those who aren't familiar, we covered the previous Meslamtaea record, Gekenden in de Shadow van het Leven, back in 2020, and that ended up on your year-end list, actually. It was a really cool record, and over time, we've just ended up covering more and more work by Floris. We recovered the Sagenland record early last year. We covered the Shavuot record, mid-late last year. And when Asgrau puts out another, which I think is coming soon, we'll undoubtedly be covering that, too.
That's exciting.
Yeah. So Floris Velthuis has become, kind of a cornerstone of the modern Dutch black metal scene. And Meslamtaea, though, is probably my favorite of his projects. Last time we saw Meslamtaea, it was a two-piece with Floris handling all the instruments along with a vocalist. But now there's a third member, Izzy, the flugelhorn player of all things. I am not exactly sure what a flugelhorn is. Like, I understand it's a brass instrument, but I don't know what distinguishes it from, a trumpet or.
It's like a chonky trumpet.
Oh, a big, an "Oh Lord, he comin'" kind of trumpet. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So last time. So Meslamtaea, I've actually listened to all the Meslamtaea full lengths. New Era back from 2005 is kind of an isolated thing. It seems like that was almost supposed to be a one-off record, then Floris shelved the project for over 10 years and then came back with a trilogy of records. The first of that trilogy, Niet and Niemendal, is really cool, but probably, I think, the weakest of the trilogy. Meslamtaea, in some form or fashion, revolves around a very nowadays combination of black metal and emo and maybe some post-punk and post-rock stuff, as well as a lot of jazz. Niet and Niemendal, as I said, was a very kind of alt-rock feeling, but also very cool. Gekendend, the one we covered a couple years back, was very heavy on the screamo influence. And now here, Weemoedsklanken, I think, really concentrates both on bringing the black metal back, like a little bit more centrally in terms of riffing, but also really pumping up and elaborating on the jazz influence that's sort of always been part of the modern era of the band. I like this one a lot. I think there's a lot to talk about how it relates to the band's discography and other kind of movements in black metal, but what are your overall impressions? I think we'll probably be arguing over a lot of the finer points here.
Well, I don't know if I feel strongly enough to argue about it, but we definitely have different opinions about it. I quite liked the last one. I gotta say, I've given it a few listens. I gotta say, this one blows right by me. It's
okay. In what sense? In that it just doesn't grab you, or?
Yeah, I listen to the songs and I forget what's in them. It's a little bit like the elusiveness of Offscourings. Just a record that is a repeated reference point for this show at this point, for certain records that are sort of slippery in a certain way, right? But it had, like Offscourings, there's actually a lot of detail here. And there's a lot of really well-crafted music to sink your ears into should you decide to pay attention to any particular part.
I can agree with that kind of fine distinction. I think this is a record that really does need to be concentrated on. Because I definitely think that if you listen to this as background music, it'll slip past you very easily.
Yeah, and it's I've been trying to listen to it for the show, so I haven't sat down in my armchair I don't own an armchair. I haven't sat down. I haven't given it a sitting down, focused listen of the kind that might bring out a lot of really subtle detail. But I have been listening to it intentionally for the show, and it does not grab me. And so I'm not sure that's my final impression. I'm doing a lot of shit right now. I'm a little distracted, right? It's possible that it's simply not the right mood or time. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to argue with you about this. All I can give is my impressions. And I also like this dude's projects, and I liked the last one, right? But what I can say is maybe the way that this fails to get hold of me as a listener might say something about outline something important about the Dutch scene. So I think one thing that sets this constellation of bands apart, and also sort of urban art scene bands like Leicester, is that the Dutch can pull off these subtle shades of emotion that put other bands in the danger zone very, very fast. Right? So stuff like I got a list here. Arjan, when I interviewed him for about Hayden's Heart and the Saganland record, right? He talked a lot about nostalgia, right? Not just in the general sense of, hey, the past was cool, but in the sense of longing for the past, right? Sad longing for the past. Melancholy is really big for this whole scene. This is a very melancholy record, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of attachment to it's a bit like nostalgia, right? It's attachment to something that's difficult to let go, right? Maybe you don't even know what that something is. Yearning for something in the future, right? Confusion, anxiety, but also things like contemplation, calm enjoyment, right? Quiet reflection, right? All these kind of it's this whole spectrum of emotions, and what they have in common is that they're very conscious emotions, right? They're very, these are states of, there are feelings, but there are feelings there are feelings that exist in very close relationship to thinking. Black metal in general, and especially black metal, deals in immediate physical impulse or immediate physical form, maybe death or immediate physical form. So in black metal, you're usually dealing with stream of raw passion of various kinds, which can sometimes shade into these other emotions. So the Dutch do quite well at dealing with conscious emotions in black metal-y music. Things that are a little more on the inner side, and doing it in a tasteful and cool way. That does not, that does not set off my alarm bells for this is too heady, this is too introspective or subjective, right? But I feel like this record might just be too far in that direction.
I'm starting to understand the differences in actually, that's the thing. It's not even differences of perspective. I think we've got extremely similar perspectives on this album. I think I wholly agree with you. I think one of the things that separates Meslamtaea from a lot of bands is it's almost completely not physical and not impulsive. It is very deliberately heady and conscious. I think you're completely right about all that. I think just for me, that's one of the things. I think it's a long hair, short hair distinction again. It's kind of funny given that this is very, ironically, very long hair music, despite how all the influences are by guys with very short hair.
I get what you mean. I really get. Yeah, okay, cool. That makes sense. Yeah, because I was going to say, part of the thing is you have more time for introspective music than I do.
Yeah, definitely.
As I've said before, my basic feeling is something like, I have quite enough inner life, thank you very much. I go to music to get outside that.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. So, yeah, I definitely get where you're
and I mean, I'm also retarded.
Well, so am I.
I know. That's
except I'm both mentally and emotionally. You're just mentally. So no, I agree with you, and I think that is an interesting distinction about this record. Is I see Meslamtaea as sort of the exception to the rule that basically, scouring the music of those immediate physical impulses should be a disaster. But this guy just puts together really fucking smart, progressive, well-designed stuff. And exactly. This is what prog should be.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you could, to me, you could almost make a meter for where this stuff goes too far, and I think I've now pinpointed it. So I did not like the latest Asgrau record, and that's because a lot of the basic riffing on it is similar to stuff in general outline to moments or parts of the phenomenal record Grandspec, which is basically a modern classic. Similar in parts, but it just goes really far into this kind of melancholy. It's about the apocalypse, but it's this kind of in sort of languid, in-between sad feeling about the apocalypse. The latest, I loved the first Kjeld record. Just huge fan, right? This last one, we gave it a good review. I liked it, but I haven't come back to it. In part because it's just this kind of, it gets too far into these sort of heady, melancholy emotions. This record, so it's interesting, but both of those, right, are more straight-up aggressive black metal bands that go too far in that direction. So I take your point that maybe there's a place in this scene for a band that just goes full bore into the head trip.
Yeah. I mean, in short, Meslamtaea is the best hipster black metal band. It's and I think it was interesting. Well, I talked to Floris a little bit last year. He really liked the review that we did of the last record. And he was talking to me, and it was interesting learning about some of his influences. Because he was saying, I really appreciate you talking about the Screamo thing, which not a lot of other reviews had talked about, which I thought was strange, because Screamo is all over that fucking record.
Yeah, all over it, yeah.
But he said, I mean, the interesting thing is, I get where you're coming from. It's really not Screamo. He said, it's the Hate Thousand bands from Belgium. This this scene of Belgian metallic hardcore from the mid to late 90s that I'm only very dimly familiar with. Bands like Creation is Crucifixion and Communion and stuff like that. So it was interesting getting some of his perspectives on where his music is coming from. But he's very forthcoming about, the primary influences are, at least for Meslamtaea, pretty far outside of black metal. But as to not talk around it, let's listen to a sample, and this will show off, I think, some of the important constituent aspects of this record. So we're going to go to Graue Muren. And you've got a really cool sequence of things that happen here. You've got this really beautiful kind of melodic, almost catatonia-style part to open it up, and then a sequence of very straightforward black metal riffs. Honestly, more straightforward and closer to the second wave than just about anything on the last record, which then takes a turn towards a sort of folk direction toward the end. So let's give this one a listen. Let's see what you think about it when you're just sitting here and just listening to it in isolation.
Thank you.
Man, that big winding second to last riff pretty much could be on that Véhémence record we just covered, couldn't it?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic riff. And that and the one that before reminds me of a thing that we pointed out on the last on the review of the last Meslamtaea that's probably worth reminding people of, which is the major influence of Toke on, I think, all of the Dutch bands.
Yeah, it really comes out super distinctly on those closing riffs there, especially that super folky variation. And then, again, because we keep pointing it out over and over, ever since we covered that Narbaleth record, we keep noticing it, the weird extended measure quality of that second to last riff.
Oh, that one confused the hell out of me in a really good way.
Yeah, I was trying to count it a few different ways, and it's very strange. It's not just a number of measures. There is a very strange time signature switch at the end.
It switches from one kind of triple time to another kind of triple time, and I'm not sure which they are.
Yeah, it's something like a series of like 4 bars of 6/8 and then a bar of 5/4. It's something like that. It's very intricate, but it feels very natural the way it's played.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those. That is a very authentic sounding, complex folk type melody. And the cool thing about it, probably, more complex than a lot of folk music. It's metalized, right? But like. That sort of rolling morphine time signature is a way that, like, in a band with a drum set, you try to approximate the isorhythmic quality of a lot of, like, folk melody. Isorhythmic meaning, right, you can't really put it in a measure.
Yeah,
It's got its own. The rhythm is pretty specific to the melody, right? Druk does this really well. Like, they fit these fantastically shaped riffs somehow into driving 4/4 rhythms often.
Yeah, it's almost easier to play than it is to write out. It feels there's a real naturalistic flow to it, but describing it is very challenging.
Exactly. Yeah. The melody comes before the rhythm. And so composed with. So that's a phenomenal riff. It's true, I'm not sure I latched on to that listening through the first time, but that part is objectively awesome, and it's my fault for not hearing that.
No, I get it, though, because I fully agree. I mean, one of the reasons I picked up on a lot of this stuff is because, I was out of town, and I listened to this for the first time just, like, on the car ride home. I've got nothing to do but just stare at the road and just internalize the details of this record. So I listened to it a couple times like that. So I think just really honing in helps you with some of that stuff. But it's also a matter of so many different kinds of things happen across this record. It's really easy for one of those elements to disappear.
I think that's one of the main problems to me. Yeah, it's just there are... And I could almost... Yeah, okay, here I'll be a little more critical now.
Sure.
It's the, and this will transition to my next sample too, but, so in that sample, right, so it gets more black, in the part right before the big glorious folk riff, and right after, right, it sounds more second wavy. Yeah. I'm familiar with those kinds of riffs from Asgrau, and there are versions of them, like this sort of really cold tandem trem riffs, single line trem riffs on the last Meslamtaea that I loved, that were very Toka-ish. I just would think when it comes to the more black, there are by volume more black metal riffs on this one, but I don't think this is Floris's A game when it comes to black metal riffing. Like the folk riff is his A game. Like, that's insane, right? That's a really phenomenal black metal riff. But like the trem stuff before this, and then the sort of stompy part at the end, just is not that engaging to me. I think in part because I've listened to a lot of this guy's stuff.
I gotcha. Yeah, I think it serves a structural purpose, but I think I basically agree with the riff on its own not being that exceptional.
They're kind of, yeah. Okay, so that's just a riff by riff thing. But in terms of the structure, a better example would be the riff at the beginning. At the beginning, you said a catatonia type thing, which is a nice way of describing it, right? It's sort of that like Sisters of Mercy via Catatonia thing. Is two sort of it, and what it is really two arpeggiated goth riffs interfering with each other. And there's really subtle stuff happening there. There's like on the fourth repetition of it, it like echoes like a round, but it's a riff quite deliberately written not to sound cool. It's sort of it. You know what I mean?
Oh, no, I totally agree. There's this again comes down to kind of a personal taste thing. There's a lot of like genuine deep-seated prog impulse on this record. There's parts that are deliberately difficult. You know, there's a deliberate sidestepping of the cool thing to do a harder, riskier version.
Deliberately, I would say, like, on purpose self-undermining at times. Like the melody wants to go to these sort of, like, big, cool Catatonia, Sisters of Mercy sunglasses melody, right? It wants to go depressive sunglasses. And instead, it's just sort of, like, pacing around in the room sort of neurotically, forgetting where it put its sunglasses, right? And I got enough of that IRL.
I was about to say, but that's what makes it cool, is the neurosis.
yeah. But like, you know, but even in that sequence, you can, I think, hear the sort of just one thing after another without many structural things indicating which have priority. There's this kind of horizontality between all details here, and there's a ton of detail, and there's a ton of different detail, and that kind of sequence is the kind of thing that over the course of an album kind of loses me.
I get you.
So let's go to another sample. So this is Schöne Lei, and this is from a track I like. And what I want to make clear is that the things that, to me, are the limitations of this record, the point is not that it's... And this is more clarification for listeners than for you. The point is not simply that it's too emo, or too tender, or, like, not grim enough, right? This is one of the more sort of tender tracks, and when it goes there, it really sticks the landing. And it's marvelous and compelling. I found myself really sort of paying attention to this part. But the first part of the track, you're going to hear a bit more of the kind of a bit more of the kind of stuff that I find less compelling. Yeah.
Oh no, I know what it is, and I know why you're not a fan of it. It's very Devin Townsend, actually.
Oh, what makes it that way?
Oh, it's hard to describe, but it's like a bunch of my close friends are huge Devin Townsend fans.
Yeah.
So I like a lot of like Strapping Young Lad. I'm not a huge fan of his solo stuff, but they play it around me a lot. There's something about the chord shaping there. Like Devin Townsend tends to use a lot of sort of open chord tunings. Which tends to give a lot of his riffing a very different quality from most metal riffing. Here Flores is playing around with kind of similar melodic ideas, these kind of shimmering, very prog sounding ideas. And then also, toward the end of that sample, there's that really cool part with that lilting keyboard line, which has, actually, if you pay attention in the left and the right channels, it's the same general melody, but with very different palm muting patterns. So you have all this kind of strobing effect going on between the left and the right ear. That's also a very Devin Townsend thing. I'll have to ask Flores about that, if that was like a specific reference point for some of this stuff.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mind any of the constitutive elements here, right? Sort of open tuning, sort of glistening I mean, obviously I like a glistening arpeggio. I like catatonia, right? The open tunings, I think I can get in a certain setting. I mean, I liked the last Meslamtaea, which also had moments sort of like this on it, right?
Yeah.
But I hear what you mean about it being arranged in a very proggy way. But yeah, that sort of like, you know, the dual, I would say, where it really gets good to me is where it fades out. On this sort of like, it releases into this kind of just big Chameleons-esque sort of pop hook.
Yeah, you specifically mentioned the Chameleons when we covered the last one, didn't we?
Yeah, and I think some, I can't remember if it was Flores or a YouTube commenter, but some people got it, which was nice. But like, it's, you know, It rolls out on this that, I mean, I actually think the sort of keyboardy part right before it is like, I like that part pretty well too. With the sort of strobing guitar and the keyboard flourishes over it, that's a beautiful texture. I like that, and then it releases in this really cool way. But before then, I'm just not crazy about it. You've got the sort of dueling trem lines in this kind of half dissonant way. It's related to ideas on the last one, but on the last record they had these distinct cutting forms, forms cutting through air, sort of clearly defined shapes that are not here, right? Here the sort of
that, yeah,
right, and it's clearly deliberate, right? They're being used as these long sustained notes. And what he's really interested in there is the way that the arpeggios are playing around them. Right? He's got the harmonized trem leads, and then he's got the arpeggiated texture shit over it.
To make a kind of metaphor, the last record is much sharper in general. This is deliberately much cloudier and foggier as a whole.
Yeah, and I think emotionally a cool thing about the last one was that it had that sort of sense of conscious emotion to it, and that sort of subtlety to it, but it was very it was always opening out on the world. And in moments like that, in moments where you got those like crisp single string, trem lines or whatever, right? It would clearly open out on a bigger vista, right? Looking out over the harbor at the, at the windmills frisking in the setting sun. But yeah, this record doesn't have as many of those moments. And so when you've just got those sort of lines kind of grating against each other and the swirling prog orchestration over it, to me, that's just kind of holding action. And then you get to the hardcore skronk breakdown.
I really like that part, actually.
Yeah, I just... to me, it just seems like... I'm not against him doing things like that. I liked parts like that on the last record, but to hear to me again, it seems sort of gestural. It's like I don't particularly like this version of the idea, and I'm just like, oh, it's one of those riffs. Yeah, so this is a good example of a song that goes from kind of neither here nor there for me to taking on some clarity right when you start to get the sheer intensity of that Townsendy density you liked, and then that eruption of melody at the end. But then I've got I found just a couple other parts that I'm only going to sample one of these because I got to do more samples on the last one than you. But I should note them both. Parts where a sort of a powerful, clearly defined figure comes to the fore. Parts with this sort of distinct melodies, right? Not just riffs. Distinct musical events happen where it sounds like Funeral Doom. Or just Doom, or 80s Death Doom. I usually try to hum the riffs.
Not even going to try on that one.
Not even going to try. There was a part that goes, well, down, down.
That is a fucking really cool riff. That's from the really early days of Doom Death, before the death metal had been sanded off of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a more... You'd probably know better than me. I mean, it's like a... This is from the track Verstoten, and which is the second to last one. And it's like a Celtic Frost riff, and really like a Hellhammer. Like, it's way more complicated than a Celtic Frost riff, and it's way, 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 way more complicated than a Hellhammer riff. But it has that kind of... the cruel architecture of a Celtic Frost riff, and the sort of lurching, off-kilter bizarreness of it is very Hellhammer.
Yeah,
right?
I get what you mean.
It's spiritually, it's like big Triumph of Death vibes.
Yeah. Dude, you gotta go back and listen to As the Flower Withers. I know I've talked about that on the show a few times. The very first My Dying Bride record.
I think I have.
It's such a weird fucking album. Everyone forgets about that one, but it's much more death metal.
Oh, no, I like that one.
Yeah.
I like that one, yeah, for sure.
I get a lot of that vibe on that riff, yeah. But no, that's really cool. And then the stuff surrounding it is very similar to that previous sample you were talking about. I think that for you, it may just be you like a lot of these ideas, you just really appreciate when they're delivered with more clarity. When some of the extra textural stuff is stripped away and it's left to stand on its own a little bit more.
Yeah, and that part is really clearly marked whereas the other stuff is part of this continuum of sort of tangled introspection. Yeah. That part is very clearly marked as like, here is the oh, we are walking through the delicately ruined cityscape. Here's the Black Monolith. Anyway, moving on. It's like we don't. Here's the Black Monolith. We don't talk about him.
well,
It's
that's good because I want to lead into my last sample.
Oh yeah, just real quick as far as naming things. Also, I was going to name the other one. The last track has a deliberately parallel moment, I think. This one's called Weemoedsklanken, which means something like to fall to ruin or to disintegrate. Verstod means to cast away. Right? They've got some very final titles.
Yeah, they're definitely they're a couplet. It feels like those two songs.
Yeah, and so it's got a more sort of lush melodic take on that same kind of architecture there. But I think those parts are very powerful, and I'm much more interested in those parts than in the terrain around them.
I can see that. Yeah. Well, talking about the continuum of sound, one thing that we haven't sampled just yet is the jazz stuff on this record, which is, it's interesting because even though Izzy is a full member of the band, the flugelhorn is not used on every track. It's really probably only on about half of them. But when it's employed, it's pretty phenomenal. And I don't know if there's a better moment than at the beginning of this track, Weemoedsklanken. This is... So, the brass stuff was present on the last record. And God knows, just over the past few years, the whole black metal band with a saxophone or a trumpet. That's become like a fucking cliche of its own. Or, we're a black metal band, but we have jazz and everything in it. But I really feel like these guys pull it off. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I was just jumping in to say, yeah, they do. I can affirm that I really liked that about the last one. Remember, they had that moment where I think there was only sax on one track, but it was brought in at the most
perfect time.
Just the apex of chaotic screamo kind of thing. And it was really, really cool. We thought that was quite well done. So the jazz element in this band makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that specifically the moment you're talking about on the last record, this is kind of that moment going again. So I'm going to talk about kind of like a greater theory of how to think about Meslamtaea afterward, but I love the way the jazz and the black metal stuff collides on this song. This is probably my favorite track on the record, so let's listen to the first half of Weemoedsklanken. Oh, fuck yeah, dude.
Yeah. Yeah, no, here it's definitely, this is one of the stronger tracks. This is definitely firing on all cylinders here.
Yeah, and but this is where I think the quality of this cloudier, more agglutinative song structuring really comes together. It's like before the jazz break that happens again, you don't even realize the flugelhorn is subtly coming in the background as a harmonizing voice until it explodes into that lead of its own. When the distortion drops out. And if you listen to this album carefully across the whole record, there's so many instances of that. Subtle layers building, in slow motion. You barely even realize they're happening until one of them dominates as the lead voice suddenly, without any sort of warning. It's just really sophisticated. It's, it's just from a craftsman's point of view, this shit is really far out front, I think.
Yeah, so it's very well done. In terms of being sneaky, there's a bit of a sleight of hand here because the flugelhorn becomes really important during the textural parts, but the thing that will grab everyone's attention is, it's the jazz part, is the saxophone, which is a guest, that's still guesting on this. This is by Otto Koke on saxophone. And I'm going to do one technical quibble here. The part at the end where he starts soloing a bit more, that sounds jazzy. The part at the beginning of this track does not sound like jazz. It's like 80s TV soundtrack or like porno soundtrack.
Yeah, and that rules.
Yeah, no, it sounds really good here. Like, it makes sense. I get the vibe. I'm just saying, it's not exactly a jazz thing.
Yeah, I get it, but we're a metal show. If it's got a brass instrument, it's jazzy. It's jazzy.
We got to stick up. We got to stick up for autists of all subgenres.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, they'll come for us.
Yeah. Well, but real quick, I just wanted to...
we did an extremely aggressive extreme metal podcast, and eventually we were knifed by the jazz fans.
we can only hope. But I mean, the thing that I wanted to say though is, after listening to this record, after listening to all of these records, I think I've started to figure out the idea of Meslamtaea a little bit better. I think it's easy to see, so Meslamtaea, what are they about? They're about, black metal plus some jazzy stuff plus some screamo, some post-punk, yada yada. I mean, that's all kind of true if you're just looking at the individual elements, but I think more importantly, Meslamtaea is about a continuum of atmosphere and mood. I don't think that, the jazzy stuff or the black metal stuff is necessarily supposed to be seen as separate parts. I think they're varying levels of intensity of the same mood. Even as kind of weird and disparate as some of these musical ideas can be, the thing that locks it all together really is that atmosphere, that, wandering the abandoned post-apocalyptic city. And you can do that through jazz, or you can do that through screamo, or you can do that through black metal. But the point is, at the end of the day, they're all walking through it together.
Yeah.
people pray, O God, please shield my friend who is suffering from cancer. If it be thy will,